Welcome back to Brace for Impact, the podcast where we champion modern philanthropy in a changing world. Here, a bold collective of visionary philanthropists, business leaders, social entrepreneurs, and experts share new ways of solving our country's problems, ways that are working. I'm Mary Rose Gunn, founder and CEO of The Four, the UK's only venture philanthropy fund dedicated to small charities. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Edwin Smith, Editor-in-Chief of Spears magazine. Spears is a leading publication for high net worth individuals and the wealth managers that advise them on everything from investing to cars to philanthropy. It has been described as the European rival to Forbes. Before his role as editor-in-chief, Edwin was head of research at Spears' research unit, and he's written for everyone from The Guardian to Esquire to Private Eye to The Spectator, as well as consulting for brands including Google and UBS. Edwin, thank you for joining me today and for agreeing to help us understand more of the modern trends when it comes to high net worth individuals sharing wealth. So I'd love to start with asking you a question around the perceptions of philanthropy. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. From your perspective, what do you think it means to the high net worths and then to the wealth advisory community and then in the media?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I think to take the first one first, for high net worth individuals at the moment, I feel as though philanthropy is something that in general, there's a wide range of people we're talking about, they're all different, but in general, it's something that people really, really want to do. They want to make a positive impact on the world. They want to make a difference. They want to do good. I think often the way that wealthy people are spoken about in the mainstream media is to frame them as sort of selfish, entitled, sort of even evil in some way, people to be suspicious of. In my experience, that's not generally the case, and they really do want to do something good. I think at the same time, they understand there are risks associated with engaging in philanthropy, and so they sometimes might hold back from doing it or from promoting it when they do it, which I think can be a frustration for some of the charities they work with. But I also think that there's a growing imperative for them both to engage with philanthropy and to speak about what they're doing. And I think that's driven by a big force that we're seeing in the shape of what people are calling the great wealth transfer. And so it might be worth kind of unpacking that a little bit and understanding what's going on there as well.
Let's start there. Tell us what you mean by the great wealth transfer. It's a phrase that gets used quite a lot these days, but I think a lot of people don't really know what it means.
Sure. Well, essentially, it's this idea that a huge amount of wealth held by the baby boomer generation is just about to be passed down to their children in broad brushstrokes. And because of various factors, including the rising price of housing stock over the lifetime of those baby boomer, that cohort, that amount of wealth that's going to be passed down is going to be larger than we've ever seen before. And the change is going to be more sudden than we've ever seen before. And so a lot of people expect there to be huge societal changes. And one of those, I think, certainly possible, is the creation of what some people are calling an inheritocracy. And so this idea that the people who do happen to inherit will have a significant advantage over their peers in the same age cohort in society who don't inherit a significant amount of money. And because of the rising house prices that we've seen, that will be felt really keenly by this new cohort, the sort of millennial generation and below. And I think people are aware of that. They're going to be aware of that in the middle of society, roughly speaking. But the people who are kind of the figureheads for all of this are going to be the people who are successful entrepreneurs, high-profile people. And so their role in society, what they're doing, I think is likely to come under more scrutiny than it ever has before. And so, as I said before, many people want to do good anyway, but there's also an additional imperative to be seen to be making an impact. And so I think that's going to drive a lot of philanthropy and hopefully a lot of positive impact. But it's also going to create challenges for those people that are doing it because it's not always straightforward.
Yeah, did you see, or do you think you've seen a change or an acceleration since the pandemic? Because certainly from where we're sitting, as I mentioned, we're the UK's only venture philanthropy fund dedicated to small charities. We work with a lot of philanthropists, both corporate and individual. And we have noticed that there seems to be much more, I think, awareness of the luck involved in having privilege, basically, and having resources. And I think COVID really highlighted to people who were able to sit in houses with gardens behind computers that and still earn money and still do their jobs, that actually they were incredibly fortunate in comparison to somebody who was a nurse who was having to go out to work every day and risk their lives. Do you think that COVID has had an impact on perceptions in that way?
For sure. And I mean, there are even concrete examples I can think of. There's a very successful entrepreneur I know called Ajaz Ahmed. He sold his business to Sir Martin Sorrell and WPP several years ago, having built it from nothing when he was either in his late teens or early 20s. I think he started in his early 20s. And, he did very well. And when it became time for him to really think about the impact he wanted to have, this was in the wake of the pandemic, and he thought about his own personal story, I think, but he also thought about the way that the pandemic had affected families at home in the UK. There's absolutely nothing wrong with pursuing these big, ambitious global projects. They're absolutely fantastic, and they are making a difference. But I think just the fact that we had all lived through that together focused some people's minds on how they could have the greatest direct impact as quickly as possible to people close to them. And so it did shift the dial in some respects. So yeah, I think that happened for sure.
So Edwin, in addition to COVID, what impact do you think is the driver that is coming from the next generation having on the generation of wealth holders at the moment? Because, how much do you think that the wish of young people who are more socially active, in many instances more socially aware than perhaps the previous generations have been, how much do you think the keenness of the older generation to support that activism and those aims, and also to try and make sure that if you have been very successful and you have been able to give your family a lot, you are making sure that at the same time your children are able to appreciate what they have, but yet also not feel a sense of guilt. What role do you think philanthropy plays in that?
Yeah, a huge role. I think I possibly was watching your podcast interview with Sir Ken Alyssa, that he said, philanthropy is enlightened self-interest. And that's something that a lot of people say, and I think it's very true. I was at a dinner for one charity recently, and there were hugely successful business people whose name all your listeners I'm sure would know, who were talking about how it was their engagement with the charity going on a trip to a country in East Africa to look at the work that it was doing with their family. This wasn't glamping in vast tents with an array of butlers on hand. This was roughing it, just driving to the sites where the work was being done, camping in rudimentary facilities. They were going because they wanted to see the work that the charity was carrying out, and they were going because they wanted their children to see it, so that their children could understand just how lucky they were. And this entrepreneur said, I tell my children all the time they're the top 1% of people on the planet. And I thought to myself, perhaps it's more like top 0.001%. But anyway, let's not split hairs. They're incredibly lucky. And so to have a sense of context and to appreciate that and to feel gratitude in your own life, that's how you can make the most of your privilege. And if you don't have that, then maybe there is a risk of becoming lost and not feeling the great fortune that you do have.
Yeah. I think the giving list, which the Sunday Times started publishing 20 years ago, I think now, has had a huge impact on philanthropy and the perceptions of philanthropy. From where you're sitting, what do you think is the biggest influence that it's had?
I think, giving that visibility to UK philanthropy. And one thing that comes up quite often, I think is quite a nuanced topic, is the difference between UK and US philanthropy. And I think being in the Anglophone world, being on planet Earth where America is still the largest economy, everything tends to get tinted with that American way of doing things. And that's a different style of doing things to the way it tends to happen in the UK. The people who are wealthy, the families who are wealthy, they have different expectations and tastes and so forth. And so the way that they do philanthropy, but the way they talk about it as well, is different. And in the UK, people are more backward in coming forward, but the Giving List has at least started to shine a light on some of the fantastic work that's been done. And I think also that the Tax List, which is another Sunday Times initiative, has shone some light in a similar regard. So more and more we're aware of the effect that these people are having. It's not completely behind the scenes. And so I think that's setting an example to others who may wish to follow them. I don't want to imply or say that I take a position on the moral imperative of what people should do with their money. I think my own view is it's largely up to them to decide. But I think it's great if they decide to do something good with it, and this hopefully encourages more people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that things like the Giving List, they just make people aware of things that they might not have been aware of, which is really a fantastic movement to have started. Because, I mean, the media narrative around philanthropy, to kind of go back to the perceptions thing, the media narrative can often be quite negative, and as you say, there are quite a lot of people who, and I think particularly in the UK and in Europe, where having accumulated wealth can sometimes be seen as being something that is not a positive thing. How do you think that we can talk, those of us in the philanthropy space, in a much more positive way in order to try and change that, the way that story is told, and how, what more can we do to make it better?
Sure. Yeah, I think there is a set of things that people can do in order to help their own projects, but also hopefully to help philanthropy at large. And I think the first thing is to, if you're a philanthropist, to choose a cause that you are really inspired by. Choose your cause wisely. I think the second thing you can do is talk about it in a compelling and perhaps even surprising, perhaps personal way. And I think the third thing that you can do is to provide data. If you have an initiative, what has it achieved? What is there still left to do? And really quantify the impact that you're having. And I've been thinking about that recently and looking at one or two charities who do it really well, and there are ways that you can unpack that and start to understand exactly how you can approach it and exactly how you can optimize the way that you speak about it and the way you do it too.
Yeah, I think we, as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time with philanthropists, and something that we also notice is the impact measurement piece is utterly vital, but it also really helps if people are getting involved with their time as well as their resource. And I think, being British, people are much more comfortable in talking about ways that they are giving things that aren't money. And it can be a really fantastic way of opening up really interesting stories if they're talking about how they've joined a board, or they've been giving some advice, or they've introduced a charity to some of their networks, which has really supported that charity and really helped. And I feel personally, and I'd be really interested to hear what you think about this, that it's something that we're really not doing a good enough job of in terms of the philanthropy sector, encouraging the media to write about this, is where people are giving time as well as skills, and really accentuating and bringing to the fore those stories where philanthropists have been catalytic in supporting charities and what they're achieving.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I would say as a member of the Fourth Estate is that to anyone who's engaging in philanthropy, whether it's an individual donor or the charity themselves, is treat the media as they are, not as you would like it to be. It's not going to change. It works in a certain way, and some corners of it work differently than other corners and so on, but basically it's there, so we may as well accept the rules of engagement. And I think that's partly why I spoke a little bit earlier about choosing the cause to support, because I think you can either choose something that is very uncontroversially good, or you should probably choose something that you accept may not be liked by everybody. And if you're willing to accept that, and you're willing to maybe face a degree of criticism, to have people who don't agree with you, then that's fine. But if your support is contingent on the current political sort of climate, then if the wind changes, it can look a certain way, and then you face a risk of some description or another. So I think finding that cause in the first place and being strategic about what it is really important. And then if you build that foundation, you can then go on to talk about it, and talk about it in a personal way. And I think there are so many amazing stories that I've heard during the course of my reporting and editing of the magazine that really do bring those personal stories to the fore. And I mean, just as a quick example, one that was very recently introduced to me was the story behind Charity Water. It's an American charity founded by a chap called Scott Harrison. And he told his personal story, which was that his mother was unwell when he was growing up. He lived in a strict religious household. To sort of rebel and I suppose kind of throw off some of the cares of his childhood, he moved to New York City, became a club promoter, was getting people into fashionable clubs and taking a cut of their money they spent on champagne and whatever else. And he got to the age of around 30 and he thought, what am I doing with my life? This is completely wrong. And to cut a much longer and a better told story slightly short, he went away and discovered the problem that people have accessing clean water in parts of the world. And he made it his life's mission to end that problem. And to hear him tell his personal story and what's driven him and what's shaped him was incredibly inspiring. He's brought so many people along with him in his journey that, they're making, I hate to get the statistics wrong, but he's certainly made a significant impact, and he's on course to achieve his ambition of solving this problem in his lifetime, and he wants to do it even faster. And I think that's testament to him telling that personal story, understanding that it's got a narrative that is very compelling, and firing people up by using it.
In terms of what the obstacles are for philanthropists in the UK in particular, what do you see as being the things that really hold ultra high net worths and high net worths back from being more philanthropic?
Yeah, I think it is to do with this idea of risk. What if I attach my name to something and it's not received well, or I'm required to speak about it in a way that I'm not comfortable with? What happens if something goes wrong, basically? I think that's a big consideration. I also think agreement within the family can be quite a big issue, but a lot of people at the moment are finding a way to turn that on its head. And I talk time and again to advisors to family offices who say that allowing the family to coalesce around philanthropy is a really effective way of getting some kind of cross-generational agreement, but also accepting the differences of views and opinions as well. So you don't all have to back the same cause. You can have some which individual people go off and support themselves, and some which the family does together cohesively. And that is wonderful in its own right, of course, but it also helps the family to find a method of working together. And I think a lot of people, anyone, no matter the wealth they have in their family, wants their family to work together and be cohesive and pass on good relationships and other things to the generations to come. And so that's a very human desire. But by focusing on philanthropy first and finding a method to do that, they can then extend that into other areas of their life, and it has a hugely positive impact. So it really is a win-win situation.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, we see lots of family philanthropists that we work with using philanthropy as it's sort of almost a test bed. If you need to get different generations working together or individuals from the same generation working together, it's a great way to start in philanthropy, where fundamentally it doesn't have huge repercussions if people disagree before you start on, right, how are we now going to run a family business? How are we now going to decide on, much bigger issues for that particular family in the long run? And it's also, I think, a lovely way in which across generations people can start to feel like they're speaking the same language, when I think particularly in this day and age things can seem very, very different, whether you're coming at it having been born in the 1950s or whether you're coming at it having been born in 2000s. It's a lovely way for people to kind of rebond. In terms of data and philanthropy, how do you think that modern philanthropists are looking at data, and what are they wanting in terms of information to help make them confident in giving?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting issue, particularly in the area that I'm looking at most often, which is large individual donors. And by and large, they come from a business background. And in business, you need to know what return on investment you're getting. And so they extend that principle to the charities they support too. And so I think to go back to the example of Charity Water, one of the great things about that is they can quantify the number of people in the world who don't have access to clean water. And so they can say, this well brought access to this many people, this well brought access to this many people. And you can see the number going down over time. So not only do you have the ability to quantify the number of people you're affecting, but you can also see the scope of the problem that you're dealing with. And so those two things combined are really, really powerful. And obviously it's not always possible to have data that behaves in that way, but I think wherever possible, it's really effective to provide people with as much information as they can possibly see on efficacy. I mean, I'm sure you have talked and worked on the fairly recent trend towards unrestricted giving.
Yeah, we're huge advocates of unrestricted giving, but yeah, it's hard without data.
Yeah, and I think there does seem to be a lot of research that supports it, but I can understand people who might shy away from it because they just don't know at the end of the day.
Absolutely. We are huge advocates, but we are also very sympathetic to the idea that putting money into something, which it can feel like you're dropping money into a well, but actually the response to that from our perspective is, if you can make sure that the charity that somebody is backing has a clear plan for what they're trying to do, then unrestricted funding becomes investment, and then it becomes really exciting because the philanthropist is working with the organisation on unlocking some kind of transformation in its ability to have impact, in its ability to scale or be resilient. And it's something that I think isn't talked about enough, is because on the one hand you have the charity sector that's saying, there must be more unrestricted giving, but on the other hand you have the philanthropy sector saying, we're a bit nervous about that. And it's how do we make those two meet in the middle? But we are big advocates for the strategic plan, and clear impact measurement is utterly vital in that. In terms of global politics, I mean, there is such a shift since the American election in what's happening. How do you think that is going to be influencing philanthropic behaviour in the UK specifically, but also more generally?
Well, I think the requirement for impact to be made by individuals and not just governments is more stark than it has been in modern times up until now. So I think and hope that will drive people's sense of responsibility and also their sense of agency, that philanthropy has a really big role to play in a world where aid is being withdrawn by governments. So that's a major factor. I also think the values that are sort of espoused by certain governments and therefore become sometimes necessary to adopt for pragmatic businesses and so forth, that's a big part of the picture as well. And I think it will be interesting to see how, for example, corporates who have supported certain charities, whether they choose to stick with those charities or they decide that perhaps that's a cause that we want to pull away from now. And going back to what we said earlier, you can avoid having that problem in the future if you think very carefully about the causes that you're going to support and you commit to the possible downside of them being unfashionable in certain quarters. So it will probably make the requirement to future-proof your giving and your support all the more clear.
I do completely agree with you on that, but I do also want to highlight to any philanthropists who might be getting nervous about dipping their toe in the water. I mean, we're generally, the kind of reputational risk stuff is, we're talking about people making really large donations to really big organisations. I mean, we're very much at the other end of the spectrum, where we are very much helping philanthropists give to smaller charities, and it's venture philanthropy, so it's about seeding the ideas for solving today's challenges with tomorrow's ideas for solving them. But do you see that there is a willingness to take more risks on new ideas? Do you think that will come with this change in global political order, that people are philanthropically thinking, we can't just let the same things happen, we need to try and do things differently? Do you think that might have an impact?
I do. And I think actually one recent winner of the Spears Impact Award, which is the award that we have every year to recognise a philanthropist who's made a massive positive impact on the world. I'm talking about a man called James Chen, and he had a charity that was mostly focused on vision, and he actually succeeded in having an amendment made to the UN sustainability goals to include sight as part of those goals, because he felt, and other people agreed with him, that the ability to see underpins so many other things that were included in the UN SDGs. And he's got this idea of moonshot philanthropy, and it's one that he wants to popularise, and it's exactly that venture philosophy. It's this idea that the really big problems in the world require ambitious thinking, ambitious people, and this idea of risk, of saying, yeah, I'm going to invest in that. I might lose it all, but I'm going to have to make a few investments to find the one that really succeeds. And just like the Sequoia Capitals of this world, the other big VC firms, it can be a really effective process. Yeah,
I think I also, though, again, will temper the sense of I might lose it all with the, actually, you very rarely lose in philanthropy. You may not achieve your moonshot,
sure.
But, even if James Chen wasn't being as successful as he is, because he's such a fantastic philanthropist, he would still be saving the eyesight of huge numbers of people around the world, even if he hadn't managed to get the SDG changed.
Of course, yeah.
And I think that's something that philanthropists often forget. It feels like an all or nothing, whereas actually, you're investing in something that is doing, it may not achieve its outsized impact, but you are still investing in something that is doing something really good on the ground. And I think that it can be, sometimes we talk to quite a lot of wealth advisors, and interesting to ask you a bit more about them in a second. But one of the things that they are saying is that they have a lot of clients who sometimes they're paralysed by the range of things to do and where do they get started and how they get started. And it can be the risks and the lack of data, or what, they don't quite know how to get started. Do you have any advice to wealth advisors who are trying to talk to their clients about these things, about how to just get them to get going?
Yeah, I mean, I would possibly look at it a slightly different way, which is that as a wealth manager, what do you think your job is? And if you went back 10 years, certainly 20 years, probably quite a number of people would say, to make my client richer. And I think that sector has evolved quite a bit in recent years to mean that people are now asking themselves, how can I help my client live a good life and achieve their ambitions? And that doesn't mean just bunging all your money in a few funds that might do quite well. It means really understanding who that individual is, who their family are, and finding ways to help them live a good life and help them achieve the full range of their ambitions. And I think more and more people in the wealth management space are understanding that. And so you see more and more people who are either qualified or studying to gain the knowledge they need to provide that kind of advice where it refers to philanthropy. All of the big multinational wealth management firms and private banks have philanthropy specialists in-house who they can call on. But even at the mid-range firms, there are individual wealth managers taking an interest, learning as much as they can possibly. And I've got a few of them in mind, learning as much as they can to give that kind of advice and to help people achieve their ambitions. So I think if they think about it in a holistic sense and they acquire the expertise and knowledge to provide the right avenues for their clients to do this, then it can have a massive effect. And we're also seeing kind of sort of at the fringes of the industry a new type of firm starting to open up. I'm not sure if you're familiar with a company called the Good Ancestor Movement.
I am. Yep, absolutely. And, they're fantastic.
And the work that Stephanie Brobby, she has got a great personal story, which is sort of almost of a Damascene conversion. And now, rather than help clients kind of keep hold of their money and use it in what she felt were occasionally questionable ways, she is now having quite the opposite effect. And when she first started, I think people were kind of surprised, and they thought the idea of having enough money and of having a company that was designed to help people give it away was kind of peculiar. But that thought that was so strange a few years ago is now much closer to the middle of the mainstream, and so we are seeing a big shift in the space, which is all to the good. And again, I mean, I don't make a moral comment as to what people should do, but I think if they have the ability to do that and to make a positive impact, then that's certainly to be welcomed.
Yeah, and the wealth transfer is a great wealth transfer, as we discussed earlier, I think is having a big push on that sense of movement. Absolutely. Towards those sorts of attitudes of feeling like, we've got enough, we don't need to constantly accumulate. We can think about how we give it away. There is a huge amount with this transfer of additional resource that is going to come into both the philanthropy and the impact investing space. Do you see anything in terms of new causes that are now much more popular than there were before? I mean, obviously the climate crisis is an ongoing issue, but is that something that the next generation are noticeably keener on supporting than previous generations? Or
my gut feeling would be yes, but one thing I've noticed very directly is the interest among probably that baby boomer generation that's going to be passing on the wealth, their interest in biotech and bioscience and longevity. And there's an opportunity here to have a massive effect on health outcomes for the wider population. But the way into it seems, is often to support companies that are making strides in that kind of biotech space. And so I think that's being really attractive. And it seemed the idea of being able to live forever, or tack a few good years on to the end of your already good life is very attractive to people. And when we had Jim Mellon, who's a British entrepreneur who invests in this space, speak at a Spears event recently, when he started talking about how to extend your life, the drugs and procedures that were being developed, everyone was immediately wrapped by this idea. It just kind of touches something in people that it really strikes a chord. And so that is a science that is developing very quickly right now. And so I think you can live forever. That's the promise of eternal youth, but also it really is a cutting edge and fast developing field. And so those things are very attractive to people. And so I've seen a lot of interest go there recently. Yeah.
That is slightly terrifying, I think, but also really exciting. And so as a sort of final roundup, what do you think are the biggest trends in the space that are going to become more and more obvious in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think one we've spoken about already, which is the great wealth transfer and just the societal shift that will happen. Everyone is talking about the money, but I think the most important thing is actually how societal attitudes are going to shift and the different way it's going to feel to have inherited or to inherit or to have not inherited, and what that's going to mean for the way we talk about things and what we expect from people. I think that's the really big thing that I draw everyone's attention to think about how that could play out and what it could mean.
Yeah, the power dynamics of that will be very interesting to watch, and how we make sure that we don't live in an increasingly unequal society. Is, I suppose, the biggest challenge of it, isn't it? No, that's fascinating. Edwin, thank you so much indeed for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have you here and to hear more about your thoughts on the sector and the potential that it has to really help change the world. Thank you so much for joining us. A sincere thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more about philanthropy and social impact, please do follow, share and subscribe to the Brace for Impact podcast. Listen on all the major listening platforms or watch the video on our website, the4.org. Thank you again and see you next time.